Let's take a minute to talk about your lab reports and what exactly should be in them and what those lab reports should look like. There are 5 key components to a lab report, and each of the 5 parts is going to correspond to one of your learning objectives for this standard 10. So if your lab report, you can consider it to be worth about 10 points, and each of the components of the lab report will be worth 2 points. Okay, so the first component is an abstract, and in the abstract, the question is, or the purpose of the abstract is that it acts as an introduction to the research. But it's a little bit more than an introduction because it explains what problem you're trying to solve and what you're trying to discover, and it contains a hypothesis. And really, you can kind of think about an abstract as a summary in just a couple of paragraphs. What is your experiment about, and what does it involve, and what are you trying to solve, and give a general outline of how you approach it. Okay, so how are you going to approach the problem or the big issue or the big question that you're trying to answer? The second component is the procedure. Okay, and there are 2 big things about the procedure. First of all, it must always be written in the third person, and it must also be idiot-proof. Okay, and we'll talk more about those in just a second. The third component is the data section, and these are your raw measurements. Okay, usually you can do it in the form of a data table, but sometimes you can create charts and graphs, and we'll look at some examples of those later on as well. But the data is generally what you're writing down as you're measuring things. Okay, so whatever you're writing down on a sheet of paper or typing up as you make measurements, that's your data. And then the analysis is where you process that data, is where you can apply the formulas or equations or whatever it is that you need to do and provide a general discussion of what you're doing to your data and how you're using your data to form a conclusion, what your data says about the big question. And then your conclusion is where you kind of kick it back out to the big scope and look at the problem that you're trying to solve again. So the conclusion needs to explain whether your data supports or rejects your hypothesis. It needs to describe possible sources of error and what you would do differently if you were to repeat this experiment. And you need to connect your conclusion to your abstract. What does your data say about the problem you're addressing? So let's look at each of those 5 components in a little bit more detail. First off, the abstract. You can consider it to be an introduction again. And the big thing here is, what is the context of your experiment? What is the problem you're trying to solve, or what observation has inspired you to conduct this research, to conduct this experiment? On top of that, you need to summarize your experiment, and in general, abstracts also provide a brief description of the results. So an abstract acts as a short summary of basically what your experiment is. So one of the big points about an abstract is you can't really write it until after you do your experiment. Once you do your experiment, collect your data, form your conclusions, that's when you write the abstract. An abstract is one of the last things that you write. And you can write the first part of the abstract, but you won't be able to finish it until you actually have some data to report, in which you give kind of a brief summary overview of what conclusions you're forming out of this. The second component here is the procedure, okay, and there are 2 big parts to this. First part is that it has to be in third person passive past tense. Okay, so that's a lot of grammar speech right there. Let's look at how this works in practice. Okay, so here are 2 examples of different ways you could write procedures. You could say that a total mass of 20 grams was measured for each type of ice cube and placed in individual 250 milliliter beakers. Okay, and so this would be part of a procedure from a group who may be studying different types of ice cubes. Okay, and that would be a good example of a procedure. It's third person. They don't use the words I, we, or you. Okay, you don't want to use any of those terms. It's passive, okay, which means that you use words like was measured or were measured in each case, and it's in past tense. Okay, so it describes what you did, but you don't really say I did this or we did this. This is what happened. This is what occurred. Okay, so what you would want to avoid is saying that either we put 20 grams of each type of ice cube in some beakers. Okay, that first of all, that's not passive. Okay, you're using the first person here because you're using the word we. It is past tense, but it's not passive. Again, using that we word there makes it not passive. And also, it's not very specific. Okay, so in the first example, you specify that it gives that you have 250 milliliter beakers, but in the second example, you don't know what type of beakers you're using. And that's also another big key component here, which leads us into the next point about procedures, is that they must be idiot-proof. And this can be a lot more difficult than it sounds, because really writing a truly idiot-proof procedure means that you always approach it from the lens of how can someone misinterpret what I'm saying. If there is any possible way that someone can misinterpret your points, or you're looking at your stuff and saying, well, I think they'll know what I mean, don't assume that they'll know what you mean, because a lot of times people can mess up your procedure. So there's an old idiom that kind of explains this, and it goes like this. The wife of a computer programmer sends her husband to the store to buy groceries. She says, get a loaf of bread, and if they have eggs, buy a dozen. Sounds like simple enough instructions, but the man came home with 12 loaves of bread, because the store had eggs, and he assumed that buy a dozen meant get a dozen loaves of bread. All right? So don't assume what people know what you mean. It's really, really easy to misinterpret your procedure. And unless you have other people looking at your procedure and replicating your stuff for you, it can be really, really easy sometimes to glance over some of those things. The third component is the data. And the big key to data is to keep it simple. Now, in a lot of cases, you'll probably just want to make a data table and leave it at that. And sometimes you'll be tempted to make charts, and sometimes charts and graphs are actually very, very helpful, especially if you need to establish a trend between two things. If you only have 2 points of data, usually a chart is not all that convenient. But if you're looking at 5 things, say, then sometimes some sort of chart or graph would be really, really helpful for your reader to understand what results are producing. So I've included here 2 examples of good graphs and bad graphs, and the big thing about graphs and data visualization in general is that you want to keep it really, really simple and make sure that your stuff makes sense. So for example, in the good example down here, it's a ratio of how many of the United States 300 million people have diabetes. Okay, so it says that 28 million people are diabetic and 79 million people are pre-diabetic. So it gives kind of a visualization of, well, that's about a third of the population. Okay, you kind of really, that sinks in a little bit because you see how much the 28 million is compared to 300 million people. Just to say 28 million out of 300 million people, if you just gave those numbers with no visualization, it can be a little bit tough sometimes to really kind of let that sink in. However, that doesn't mean that all instances of data visualization make sense. So for example, right here, this is one where if you look at the percentages, it's based on an interview, a survey of the baby boomer generation and how they describe themselves. But if you look at the numbers, they're all given in percentages, but they don't add up to 100%. These are all answers to different questions, and yet the visualization seems to imply that the total person should add up to 100%, but it doesn't. Okay? So it's important to keep in mind exactly what your data is saying, and if you try to find a good way to visualize that, it can really help the reader out, but be sure that it makes sense. The fourth component of a lab report is the analysis section. So this is where you take your data and you really analyze it, okay? And so you use formulas and calculations. That's the first component. So any formula that you use, any calculations that you make, anything that you're not directly measuring, that's all part of your analysis. And in addition, in the analysis, you want an explanation of how your data applies to your big question. Okay, so your analysis is not just using equations, it's not just numbers, there should be some paragraphs involved here. Okay, and here's a really advanced example, but you notice how they embed sort of the equations in with the text and what they're describing. Okay, so if you include an equation, you want to make sure that you explain what exactly you're doing with that equation and that formula and why. What is the purpose of that equation and what is the outcome that you're getting because you're using that equation. And in this analysis, in general, you want to look at whether or not your data supports or rejects your hypothesis, which gets us into the conclusion. Okay, the conclusion is where you tie it all together. All right, so bringing it all together, applying your data to your hypothesis, and really kind of breaking down exactly what you did right, what you did wrong, what you would change in future experiments. Now remember that a hypothesis can only ever be supported or rejected. You can never prove a hypothesis to be 100% true in all circumstances at all times. So one of the big things to include in the conclusion is to further support your hypothesis, what other research should you do? Okay, so if you were to do more experiments to test your hypothesis, what other things would you do to establish that trend? Okay. And another big thing about the conclusion is that it can be kind of easy to drone on in the conclusion. But a really good example of this is if you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings trilogy, especially the extended editions, you'll know that at the end of the third movie, the ending kind of goes on for a very, very long time, and everyone's just kind of looking at their watches wondering, okay, well, when is this going to end? Okay, so the point is that in a conclusion, usually a couple paragraphs is all that you need to get your point across. So you don't want to go too long, you don't want to drone on and on, but at the same time, your conclusion can be the most important part of your paper because it's what really kind of establishes the validity of your experiment. Okay. So once again, looking at the 5 components all pieced together, you should have an abstract which acts as a summary of your experiment, okay, summarizing what you're doing, why, and giving a brief overview of the results. The procedure that you're doing to test the hypothesis that you outline in the abstract, and remember that procedure must always be idiot-proof and written in passive third person, past tense. Data, the third part, remember that's your raw measurements, and if you want to use a data visualization like a chart or a graph, make sure it makes sense. The analysis, okay, so looking at formulas, equations, etc., and applying those things to your data, and also explaining and elaborating how your data applies to your big question there. And then lastly, the conclusion, explaining whether your data supports or rejects your hypothesis, possible sources of error in your experiment, and what you would do differently if you were to redo this experiment, and connecting your conclusions to your abstract and your hypothesis, okay, and what future experiments you would do to help support that hypothesis further.